Hari Hari Bol. Welcome to Germany. We are in Berlin right now. Today is what? July 9th, 2016. We are spending a few days in Berlin on our way to Woodstock Festival. And Yamini wanted to talk about values versus emotions. It's something that we've talked about before, but she wanted to specialize in that topic. And the reason was because that I said you should act on your values, not on your emotions. Of course, if your emotions are aligned with your values, then there's no problem acting on your emotions, because your emotions will represent your values. But often our emotions don't represent our values. They often represent what we don't value, or what we don't believe is right. And so, emotions that are aligned with values, if the values are Krishna conscious, it's wonderful. The problem is, if your values aren't Krishna conscious, then it's not wonderful. Wow, look at that. When I knock the chair, it knocks the table. It knocks the floor, and the floor knocks the table. Okay. I will control myself and not knock the chair. So, generally when we speak about values and emotions, when I contrast them, I'm talking not about emotions which are aligned with values, but rather I'm talking about emotions which are reactive. You know, emotions which are basically, in the modes of nature, passion and ignorance. We talk about values, we're talking about things, generally we're talking about things which are in the mode of goodness. And when we talk about values, we're talking in this sense of things which, in the spiritual sense of things which are right, are shastric, are connected with Krishna, are the characteristics of Krishna consciousness, the characteristics of a devotee, or one who wants to be a devotee. What do we value? We value purity, we value cleanliness, we value honesty, we value sense control, we value integrity, we value compassion, we value forgiving, samo dhammas, equanimity, sense tapas, we value austerity, socham, samodhamastapo socham, arjavam, honesty, religiousness, these things. These are our values, and we have so many values that Prabhupada has given us, that Shastra gives us. So we really don't have a shortage of values, or we don't have a lack of clarity on what our values are. As you might have if you're not a devotee, because your values may be relative. At the same time, as we grow up, we learn values. You learn them as little kids are taught to be honest, are taught to be nice, are taught not to lie, and so on. And then, depending on culture, you'll get different values. For example, in India, I don't know about now, but previously, if you grew up, you would gain certain values about marriage that are much different than the values that you gain, at least today, in the West. And so, you may be acting on your values, but the problem is that your values may be wrong. So, even if we're having a discussion about values versus emotions, if your values are off and you're aligned with your values, then still that's not good. That's not what we want. So when I talk about values versus emotions, that I'm referring to Krishna conscious values. And when I use the word emotion, I don't mean to say it's wrong to feel. But in this context, when I say versus, it's contrasting Krishna conscious values with
Goodbye.
Hare Krishna. We'll see you later. We're contrasting Krishna conscious emotions with, Krishna conscious values with reactive emotions, or emotions which are generated from the lower modes of nature, the kind of reactions that we have that we later regret or we realize aren't Krishna conscious. So I often tell devotees, act on your values rather than your emotions. And women tend to be more emotional than men in general. So it even makes it a little more difficult for women. Certain times of the month, even more difficult. So we have to take these things into consideration. So this is a general idea. Now, in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Yasya shastra vidhim utsrija. We give up the injunctions of the Shastra, vartate kama karata, to act whimsically, and whimsically means to act according to how I feel, what feels good, what feels right, what makes me feel happy, that I do. Vartate kama karata. And then Krishna says that you won't achieve siddhim or sukham, happiness, or perfection if you act that way. Because unless you're pure devotee, then your whimsical action, it's not whimsical. Because what you feel is what Krishna feels, and so it's perfect. There's no problem. But when you're learning to be Krishna conscious, then what you feel is materially conditioned by the modes of nature. So Krishna calls that whimsical. So defining this within Vedic terms, we can say therefore that whimsical action is action under the modes of passion and ignorance. And more specifically, whimsical action is just feeling. Now I'm angry, so I'll yell at you or I'll become upset with you. Now I'm feeling good, I'll be nice to you. And therefore, Chanakya Pandit said, don't trust anyone who can't control their senses, because one moment they're nice, like Kamsa, he was nice. He apologized to his sister for not being nice. He came to his senses, so to speak, and said, these children of yours that I've killed, I shouldn't have killed them. So at one moment he's nice, but then the next moment he talks to his ministers and they say that you should not forgive her. Actually, you should kill all her children. Well, he said, I don't have to kill your children. Then they convinced him to kill the children. Then after he killed the children, he apologized later and said, I really didn't have to. And then his ministers said, what you really have to do is kill all the children because you really don't know where Krishna is. So then he decided to kill all the children, destroy, sacrifice, Brahminical culture like that. So that's why Chanakya Pandit says, don't trust a person who can't control their senses. So that's a good example of acting on emotion. It's whatever you feel in the moment, you do. And it's not based on any higher values or principles. So that's what I'm speaking about. And so often we react how we feel. I feel lusty, and so I act in a lusty way, and then I may say things like, I can't really control myself, which may be true, but I don't really believe that you can't control yourself. I believe more like you're not making an effort to control yourself. Or there may be things going on subconsciously that are affecting you that you have to deal with. But that's the idea. When you feel like, I can't control myself, that's how you feel. Then, that's how you feel, then you're going to act based on this, because that's how you feel. That's my whole point. How do you feel? I feel like I can't control myself. So are you going to control yourself? Maybe not, because if you believe you can't, why would you try? So more and more, as society degrades into passion and ignorance, more and more people will feel that I can't control myself, I'm a victim of circumstances. Now, there is some truth to it, because we are conditioned souls, but the falsity is, part of it is that we're not doing anything about it, that we give in to it. So we give in to the idea of, this is how I am, I've always been this way, I've always acted this way, so this is how I continue to act. And then, if that's the case, then what is the value of Shastra? Because Shastra is directing you what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Pravittim cha nirvittim cha. Na vidur asura. the non-devotee, the godless people, they don't know what to do, what not to do. They do what they want to do. And if you tell them, you shouldn't do this, you can see in our society people are really aggressively against that. They think it's not politically correct to come along with absolutes of good and bad. They don't like that. They're really against it. It's just not popular. It's right for you, and it's not right for me. That's the way they look at it. So Shastra is giving some absolute idea. This is what you should do, pravritti, and what you shouldn't do. And so that's how we operate. And so our goal is to be aligned with the injunctions of Scripture, aligned with those values, those principles, and then our actions are molded and guided by them. Whether we feel like it or not, because you might say, but I'm a conditioned soul, so how can I act based on those instructions when I'm weak and so forth? But the point is that these instructions were given to conditioned souls, so you can't use that argument. These instructions are not for liberated souls. If you're liberated, you don't need those instructions because you'll always do the right thing. So to say, I'm conditioned, how can I do the right thing, is to undermine the very principle of Shastra, because Shastra is given to conditioned souls. Conditioned souls do the wrong thing, right? So that's Shastra is given to them. So it comes more down to a commitment. Of course, the problem that we're dealing with is we're dealing with our past samskars or our past values, and our values may not be, and often are not, congenial to Krishna conscious values. So we're conditioned by these wrong values. So even though the Krishna conscious values are in our head, our actual fundamental conditioning is different. We don't see things the way Shastra tells us to see things. We see things the way we see things, according to how we've been raised, how we've been conditioned. So Krishna consciousness ideally is meant to recondition us, isn't it? So that we start to see things in a Krishna conscious way. So we have this idea of what's called Shastra Chakshu, see through the eye of Shastra. So maybe I don't spontaneously see things through the eye of Shastra, but I kind of reprogram myself so that when I see the world, I see it philosophically. And if I see things philosophically, then the tendency to act whimsically is reduced, because how I see things will tend to be how I feel things. So if I'm seeing things materially, I'll tend to feel them materially. If I see you through the eye of Shastra, then I respect you. And then if you do something that's upsetting to me, possibly I won't get upset because I see you in a different way, in a different light. Or I might see you as a struggling, conditioned soul who's fighting with the modes of nature. And although you treat me unkindly, I don't react unkindly because I see that you're fighting your own battle. Otherwise, if you treat me unkindly, I feel bad, I feel offended, I feel demeaned, I may feel betrayed, whatever, and then I react based on how I feel. So that's one principle. If you see things in a Krishna conscious way, you won't have to deal with a lot of these rajasic and tamasic emotions because you won't see things in that perspective. So this is generally how Shastra is trying to help us align with our values by teaching us how things are and guiding us to see things that way, even if we don't naturally see it, but you kind of remind yourself that this is how it is. So like I can go out today on the street and I can deal with people in a conditioned way. So I'll see certain people that due to my conditioning I may not like, and then I'll have emotional reactions to them. I'll just see them, I won't trust them, I won't feel good, maybe I'll feel afraid, I won't feel like being nice to them, whatever. Or I can see things from Krishna's perspective, how Krishna wants me to see it, and then I would be more friendly to those people, or kinder, or just internally I might pray for them. that they can get Krishna's mercy, something like that. So the way I'm seeing is affecting my emotional response. So that's another aspect of how to deal. If I told that story, many times I've told this story of how I was managing a temple, and it was very upsetting because the devotees were young and not that experienced, and so often it would be frustrating dealing with them because they didn't do things to the standard that we needed them to do, and they just didn't have that background or that experience. And then I realized that, and I changed my vision of them, and when I changed my vision of them, then my responses to their mistakes changed. So a lot of it was about expectations. I was expecting them to perform like Americans. They weren't Americans. They didn't have the same background, culture, and education and experience. So once I understood that, my expectations changed, and then my emotional response to their failures changed. So I didn't get upset, I just understood them. So this is a way in which altering our vision has an effect on our emotions. A lot of times we're getting upset very easily because we expect certain things, and people don't deliver. An interesting thing about expectations is that a lot of times we have expectations for people, but there's no contract. And what I mean by no contract is that the person doesn't know that you expect it. Just like you may be very, what's the word, when you're on time? There's a word, why can't I think of it? What's the word? Okay. Actually, I can't go to chat unless I type in the name of this class. Oh, I skipped it. Okay, I can go to chat. You know, when you're on time, there's a word for it. I can't think of it now. Punctual, yeah, that's the word. So, if I am punctual, I expect other people to be punctual. And when they're not punctual, I get upset. I can get upset, right? When you're in India or some other countries and you learn that 9 o'clock means 9:30, could even mean 10, it's easier to deal with. And when you accept that, you know, just because people said they were going to come at 9 o'clock doesn't mean they actually meant that. And you didn't understand that because in your country, when they say 9 o'clock, they mean 9 o'clock. But in another country, when they say 9 o'clock, they don't mean it. And so if you're punctual, you get upset until you understand, well, in this culture, 9 actually means 9:30. And that's true for everyone. So then you adjust. So sometimes just changing your perception about a situation will help you control your emotions. It will alter your expectations. And then the point I was making before, which is very important, is that our expectations are not always what other people know is expected of them. So I'm expecting something of you because those are my values. But I haven't communicated that to you, so I'm expecting it of you because I'm assuming that you would share the same values I share. But I never verbalized my expectation to you. And then you don't live up to those expectations, and then I become upset with you. Right? Although you didn't really know I expected that. You didn't really know that saying you would come at 9 meant that I expected you to come at 9. Because in your culture, nobody would expect you to come at 9 if something starts at 9. As funny as that sounds. But you understand the principle. That adapting your vision and especially adapting your expectations to become more realistic, then often it changes your emotional response. Okay? So that's one way of altering emotions, where you don't actually have to alter them. You alter your perception, and then your emotions will follow. Your expectations change. Like sometimes parents have to do this with children. They're expecting one thing, and the children, they can never do that, and the parents are getting frustrated. And when they accept, well, my child's not going to be a genius scientist, and it's just a reality that I accept, then it's okay. Then I'm okay. They're going to be something else. So changing perception is a very quick and easy way to change emotions. Now, let's go to something deeper. Sometimes we are conflicted or we are disturbed on a very deep level. So our emotional response is not always so much about what's happening around us, but more about what's happening inside of us. And then what happens is people don't really do anything wrong, but our expectations are so off the charts of reality that when people don't live up to our expectations, which basically nobody would, we become upset. And a lot of those expectations, they're unrealistic because we are often lacking in our own self, in our own self-satisfaction, or our own, what should I say? We're in some way lacking. There could be many ways we're lacking. We're in some way lacking, and we're expecting others to make up for our lacking. Like maybe you don't like yourself, so you expect others to compliment you all the time to make up for the lack of the fact that you hate yourself. And then if they don't compliment you, then you end up hating them because you depend on them to compliment you to balance your lack of your own self-respect or whatever, or self-love. Or you understand? So you may have some failing internally. There's some need, deep need internally that that nobody's going to be able to fulfill. But you've created that need because you're lacking so much. And maybe there's things that you should be able to do as a mature adult, but you depend on others to do, and if they don't do it, you become upset. But normal adults wouldn't expect others to do that, and therefore the adults around you wouldn't expect that they would have to do that for you, and so they don't, and so your expectation is unrealistic, and then it's because of your own lacking, and then you're depending on people to do things that they shouldn't do. They don't, and you're depending on people to make up for what's missing in you. If they don't make up what's missing in you, then you become upset. So that's another reason that we stray from our values, even when our values are very clear. As I said, for us as devotees, our values, they're quite clear. We know what they are. And one of our values is to be equipoised, to not be upset, to not be elated or disturbed, but to be balanced. The things are good, okay, don't go crazy that they're good. Things are not good, okay, don't go crazy that they're not good. So how are we going to be equipoised if if there are things which are within us that we are depending on others to give us to make up for our own personal lackings? And others rarely will give what you need, and then you'll be very much like a roller coaster in depending on others to fulfill your needs. This happens in marriage also. Not a lot of times people get married and with the hope that the other person will kind of fill in all the blanks where they're missing, and to some degree that's true. But if we think everything's going to be fixed because of this other person, it's not true. People can help you, but they can't fix you. That's something you do yourself. And so when people get married thinking that the other person is going to make up for whatever they're lacking, it doesn't work out. And then they become frustrated with that person because they were hoping that person would do something that's unrealistic, that they would fix them, or hoping they would get fixed. I've seen this a lot. It can happen with guru-disciple relationship also. It's kind of like thinking that the other person is going to do magic. No, the guru does magic, but the disciple has to imbibe the magic and do the work. So it's not just by having a guru or just by taking initiation that the magic happens. You know that, but sometimes disciples feel that, well, if I just have a guru or I just get initiated, everything will automatically work itself out. No, we always have to do the work ourselves. So the spiritual master, he's the impetus, the inspiration. But inspiration is a little bit like the wind. So Shastra says the instructions are like the wind. You have to put up your sails and take advantage of the wind. If you think the wind is also going to put up your sails, then you'll be disappointed. You'll be frustrated. You might even get angry at your spiritual master or your husband because he didn't solve all your problems, right? So when we react to situations and get very upset and sometimes question why. This could be one of the reasons. Or we question, why in this situation am I so upset? Other people in this situation don't get upset. So there's some things going on internally where we perhaps become too dependent on other people. And Prabhupada says in the Bhagavatam, too much dependency is a weakness, that we shouldn't be too dependent on another's mercy. And it's kind of interesting because our philosophy teaches us to be dependent on mercy. And now here Prabhupada's saying we shouldn't be too much dependent on another's mercy. Yeah, spiritually we're dependent on mercy, but as I've said many times, mercy comes in the form of instruction and then you execute the instruction. But I think the sense of Prabhupada means is that we become irresponsible or lazy, and that we expect other people to do things for us, or we expect other people to solve our problems. And then we become weak because we don't take our own volition. So this makes sense in light of what we're discussing here. How you may, if you're depending too much on other people to solve your problems, then you can become very frustrated and angry. And you know what it's like when you expect people to do something and they don't. And then you have to question yourself, why was I expecting that? Is there something, I mean, like sometimes, okay, you expect someone to be on time, that's different. But if there's something lacking in yourself and you're expecting someone to fill that, then you have to understand that, because once you understand it, you won't get upset. And you'll work on it yourself. And you'll see it's your work, it's not their work. So a lot of times when you kind of have meltdowns and breakdowns, that means there's something that you're expecting that you need to really be working on internally yourself, to give yourself those things, to get those things, whatever they are. And you can get them oftentimes, or most times, if not always, more easily from yourself. Let's say you expect some kind of spiritual nourishment. Well, sit down and read Prabhupada's books, you'll get spiritual nourishment. You know, maybe you're expecting to get it from your spiritual master or your husband or your wife or the temple president, they're not getting it and they're not giving it to you and you're somewhat frustrated. Well, in this example, and I think this is a good example, just give it to yourself. You know, sit down and read and get nourished and you'll be happy and you won't be so dependent that other people have to give it to you. You take it on your own. Sometimes I even see devotees, they lose faith in Krishna because they're asking for Krishna's mercy and they're not getting what they need. But a lot of times they're not giving themselves what they need. They could get what they need, but they're thinking, in an unhealthy dependent way that Krishna is going to give it without them making the proper effort. So I think that's important to understand. That, or sometimes what I see is that we do something wrong and we get a result and then we blame Krishna for the result. But factually, it's just a material result we got from doing something. You know, like for example, just a very obvious example, you're not careful while you're nailing a nail into a piece of wood and you hit your thumb. And you could blame Krishna for that, but obviously it was your neglect. And you could say, why did Krishna allow me to do that? And I would say, why weren't you focusing? Why weren't you concentrating? Why do you think that Krishna is supposed to do everything for you? So once you understand you have certain responsibilities, the material world works in a certain way, you have to take care of yourself, it's not Krishna's responsibility, then you'll stop blaming Krishna for problems that you yourself created. A lot of times we create problems, we're not even aware we created them. We think it's just some past karma, when actually it was immediate karma for doing the wrong thing, for being neglectful or making a bad choice. And then we might get upset with Krishna. That, of course, sometimes we get upset with ourselves. Oh, I'm so stupid. And then we get emotionally bankrupt because we're angry with ourselves. And that's also a deep problem that's creating that we're we're always denigrating ourselves and belittling ourselves. So if you're always denigrating and belittling yourself, then when you fail at something, you'll fall apart. If you're not denigrating yourself, if that's not how, if you don't feel there's something wrong with you or you're a bad person or a failure, then when you fail, you just look at it and say, okay, well, what do we do now? That's all. There's no emotional baggage, or there's no emotional upset. But so if you have very negative feelings about yourself, you think, well, I'm bad, I'm a bad person, I'm a failure, I'm a this or that. Then when you do something wrong, that eats right into your sense of self, of who you are as a person. Whereas if you're in a healthy state of consciousness, then you do something wrong, it doesn't eat into your person. It's just you did something wrong, that's all. That's the word shame. Shame is when you feel that when you do something wrong, you yourself are a failure, rather than the activity was a failure. Right? Now, you might feel guilty, I did this wrong. The activity was a failure, but you're not a failure. But when shame overcomes you, then yeah, you feel you're a failure. So that's how to understand. We get these very strong reactions sometimes, the emotional reactions, because internally we feel that we're a failure. And then sometimes you'll see, I don't know if this has happened to you or you've seen this in other people, sometimes when a person feels they're a failure, and then someone tries to help them or correct them, there's this violent reaction. They get really upset that someone's trying to help them. Why? Because they already feel like they're a failure, and then if someone tries to help them, they interpret that as I'm a failure. So the person was just trying to point out, it's better you do it this way, it'll help you. And the person was very genuine and very kind in giving that advice, but then the person breaks down. And I'm sure you've seen this or experienced this or both. So these are some examples that show how when you have this tendency to feel there's something wrong with you, then little things can upset you. And then again, you'll be derailed from your values, because as devotees, our values are to be very controlled and very kind with people, equipoised, to be very much in control of our lives, in control of our words, in control of our emotions, to be very kind to others, to be in a service mode. And when we have internal issues, then all these emotional reactions come out that have absolutely nothing to do with our values. Isn't it? And it's almost like the values don't mean anything. So what we're trying to do is imbibe the values on a deeper level, so the values become constants, and that when we're in difficult situations, or we're in any kind of stressful situation, or any kind of challenging situation, that the values are so deeply ingrained within us that that's how we act. Even, and this is interesting, even we don't feel the values, we may feel very upset or very jealous, or whatever it is, lusty, greedy, whatever it is. But our values are so strong within us that they override the feelings. So then that verse where Krishna says, we give up Shastra and then we act whimsically, we won't act whimsically, because we might feel whimsical, but we won't act whimsically. So this is the point we want to get to. You see, a lot of the problem we have is that we're so used to acting on our feelings that then when we feel something, the idea of not acting on how we feel can become extremely foreign, because many of us were not raised that way. You know what I mean? It's like, we're just, how I feel is how I act. It's like the mind. The mind says, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad, this is what you want, this will make you happy. And we're so conditioned to identify with our mind that we don't detach ourselves from the thoughts to look at them and say, is this what I want, or is this just a conditioned response? Right? And when you can look at it and say, it's a conditioned response, then you won't act on it. But we're generally, or often, we're not conditioned to act that way. We're conditioned to think the thoughts, we identify with thoughts, and we identify with feelings. Therefore, it is said, don't believe everything you think, and also we can say, don't believe everything you feel. It's not that you can't believe what you think, and it's not that you can't believe what you feel, but don't believe, until you're Krishna conscious, don't believe everything you think, and don't believe everything you feel. But our conditioned nature is because we identify, not only do we identify with thoughts, we identify with emotions. This is how I feel, and so this is how I act. But you're not those feelings. Those are just feelings. Feelings are subtle they're the subtle parts of thoughts. So you think something, you can think something without feeling it, right? Oh, it's a nice day. I'm looking outside, it's sunny, it's a summer day, there's flowers. So it's a nice day. I might not have any emotional response to that other than it's an analysis. Oh, today is sunny. Or I can look out and I can just feel really good. I look out, I'm looking outside, there's flowers right here outside my window. It feels really good. It feels nice, the sun's coming in, it's warm, it just feels good. So now the thought has become a feeling, or the feeling came before the thought. So now, feelings can be good, feelings can misguide us, feelings can direct us. Feelings can be aligned with our values, they can be antagonistic to our values. So if you can understand that don't believe everything you think and don't believe everything you feel, that becomes your guideline. But rather, believe what you value, act on what you value. That's the mantra. That's what we want to come to. And as I'm saying earlier, in order to come to that, for some of us, we're going to have to clean out a lot of internal garbage because we've been impregnated with a lot of wrong ideas. And those become natural responses to situations. Maybe you're impregnated with the idea, don't let anybody take advantage of you. You have to stand up for yourself. You have to step on people's toes to get ahead. All right. To some degree that may be true, but in Krishna consciousness, those generally are not our values per se in terms of how we normally operate. We operate more in the sense of giving than protecting our own turf. So we want to, or we need to, imbibe the Krishna conscious values more deeply than the material values that we've inherited before we were devotees. But even if we can't do that immediately, at least if we can get to this point where if I'm feeling something, it doesn't mean that I need to act on it, but rather, as I'm feeling something, I ask myself, is this how I want to act? Are these emotions aligned with Krishna conscious values? What is the proper way to act? So you have to have some sense of detachment on an emotional level, because detachment gives you objectivity. So if you're detached, you can look at how you're feeling and analyze whether I should act on these feelings. And that's not always easy. As a conditioned soul, it's hard to detach from my feelings. Like you want something, you say, I feel this, and I say, it's not good. And you say, but I have to have it, or I have to do it. That's being entangled by feelings. You're not detaching yourself enough to look at the situation and then base your feelings on a higher perception of it, on a more Krishna conscious perception, or what we would say, by allowing yourself to intellectualize over what you're feeling over the situation and then base your feelings on something higher than just raw gut emotions. Now, if you're completely Krishna conscious, or if you're on higher stages of Krishna consciousness, this discussion wouldn't even be necessary, but this discussion is there for those of us who are still dealing with anarthas, because on higher stages of Krishna consciousness, your natural taste is Krishna conscious. So therefore your feelings, your emotions, your desires, your senses, they're all going to line up. So Eddie has a question. Very important points you are talking about. I have this kind of problem with people. And I try to have expectations about anybody, meaning everybody, everyone. But this is very difficult for me. I don't want to fall in confusion. What to do about it? Change your expectations according. Well, there's two things you can do. I mean, you can deal only with people who can live up to your expectations. If you have control, you can do that. Or you can adjust your expectations according, or you can communicate your expectations to the people. Say, this is what I need from you. This is what I expect. What do you expect from me? I'll do my best to live up to that. You can adjust your expectations based on realistically what you know you can expect from them, which I think when you're married is very important. You see what people like and you learn to accept them for what they're like. And then if you're very strict, just you have high standards, you only make friends with people with those standards. You may not have many friends and you may not have many people to work with. If you have a business or a company, I think it's easier to do because you're hiring people and you can hire people who can live up to those standards. In real life, you can't hire everyone you work with. And in Hare Krishna movement, we don't hire people, everyone's volunteers. So you can't force volunteers. It's the way it is. So you have to maybe have more realistic expectations. Because a lot of our frustration is just around expectations. And as I'm saying before, it's very important to understand that a lot of our emotional response is around values that we cherish that other people may not, which we expect them to follow, even though we never articulated, we never told them, this is what I expect. We just assume as devotees they would be a certain way. And a lot of times we get frustrated making assumptions of how devotees should be. Now, you can make assumptions based on Scripture. The Scripture says this is how a devotee is. But you can't make assumptions based on particular devotees, because although this is how a devotee is, it may not be how that devotee is, because that devotee is developing and they're not on the highest level. So when we expect devotees to be how we read about devotees in Scripture, it can be very frustrating. And rather, we have to look at devotees in terms of their sincerity. Say, well, I understand he's sincere, he's trying. I appreciate that sincerity. But the details may differ. So that's important consideration. So now you say, but it's supposed that people that want spiritual life, they have to follow the Shastras. Yes. Especially if they have a lot of time in Krishna consciousness. Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of like we could say that's the textbook. I don't know if you're familiar with this, the textbook description. The textbook description is what our Shastras describe as a pure devotee or an advanced devotee, and what would be expected of someone who's been a devotee for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But realistically speaking, you can't expect that of everyone, because everyone progresses according to their desire, according to their application of Krishna consciousness. And therefore, what we learn is to use those standards against ourselves, you can expect more of yourself, as long as it doesn't depress you if you don't achieve what you expect, as long as it's done in a healthy way. But to expect more from others, although it's natural, it's kind of a trap. Because ideally we should be appreciative of others and also compassionate, in the sense that everybody is fighting their own battles. So Everyone is not perfect. And we're all trying, and we're all trying to overcome our conditioning. And sometimes, despite the best intentions, we fail. And also, what you'll find in Krishna consciousness is that some people are very nice devotees, but they're just placed in the wrong service due to circumstance. Sometimes they're not qualified for a service, but there's no one else to do it, so they do it. And they fall short in many ways. Not necessarily because of spiritual weakness, just because of a lack of material ability. They may not be good communicators. They may not be good with relationships. And then we'll look at them and say, you've been a devotee for such a long time, you should be able to have better relationships. That's true, but at the same time, for that person it may not be possible. So, then what? It's just how it is. So, to be more tolerant and accepting of others it's very important for your own Krishna consciousness. Again, it goes back to that point I was making, is if you change perception, you change expectation, then you'll be less frustrated with people. And just you don't expect, just expect that devotees are human and they'll be lacking in many ways. And often when you see it that way, then it's easier to appreciate what they're doing. You have less expectations. It's harder to appreciate people. It's harder to appreciate people if you have high expectations. If you have no expectation or low expectations, then whatever they do, you'll appreciate, right? Does that make sense? And so, you want to evaluate your own performance. You want to judge yourself against higher standards in Krishna consciousness. But when you do that with others, it doesn't help you. I understand that you would expect senior people to be more advanced, but we're all very highly conditioned. And even though we make advancement, that conditioning still remains, even on higher stages of Krishna consciousness. And it takes time to overcome it, If you're by nature lazy, even when you're very Krishna conscious, a little bit of that tendency may still remain. If your nature is to be passionate, even you're very Krishna conscious, that nature may still remain to some degree. It's just your conditioned nature, and so that we have to understand and accept. Some like you'll see, what appears to be very good qualities manifest in very young devotees or even in non-devotees that may not manifest in very senior devotees. And that becomes confusing. But it doesn't mean that the senior devotee is not advanced in other ways. It just means that he's conditioned in a certain way. And therefore his nature may not be to be very warm and friendly, whereas a non-devotee may be very warm and friendly. Warm and friendly. But when a non-devotee is warm and friendly, it's generally part of their nature, their personality, not a symptom of their spiritual advancement. Anyway, sometimes it's confusing when we see that. But if you adjust your expectations in defining what is spiritual advancement, you'll see that many senior devotees are very spiritually advanced, but they may not have qualities that you would expect of them. They may never have them, or never have much of them because of their nature. So that's how to deal with that. Okay. Now, does anyone have any questions so far about what we're talking about? I think what's good is to review your values, like what is important to you? What do you value? What are your Krishna conscious values? Do you value relationships? Do you value being kind? Do you value being supportive? Do you value being helpful? Do you value being controlled? All these things, what you value, write them down and try to imbibe them deeply within your consciousness, so that when you're in situations where your emotions start to take over, these values, because you've imbibed them deeply, you'll immediately connect with them. because they're strong. And I think the reason we don't connect is because a lot of values we have, they're not prioritized. They're not energized within us. So we can easily act in contrary ways. Later to regret, but in the moment act in contrary ways. But if we value the importance of certain behaviors, then we'll tend to act that way. And so if you don't, or at least this is the assumption that I make, if someone is always becoming upset and disturbed or whatever, acting in ways which are not Krishna conscious, then I make the assumption that the opposite, the value that would negate that, is not strong. That I'm not, if I'm always becoming upset, I'm not attached, I'm more attached to controlling than having a peaceful relationship. Isn't it? I'm more attached to having things done in a certain way than having a good relationship. Because I'm willing to get upset with this person who's failed because I value the work being done more than the relationship. So if you understand that, you can start to create values around the way you want to behave. And if you value a relationship more than what's right or wrong, then it's easier to connect with those values. Or even better, those emotions, those former emotions, the anger, the agitation, they'll subside. They won't even rise because you know that if I get upset with this person, it's going to disturb the relationship. And now that I realize how much I value relationships, I won't allow myself to get disturbed. Does that make sense? Yes, it does make sense. If you think about it, a lot of the upset that's happening to you is just because your values around that situation don't prevent you from getting upset. You're valuing, I've seen this so many times, that if we value getting something done more than we value a relationship, then we could harm the relationship in order to get the service done. Right? Yes? Now, somebody rang the bell downstairs, which means I think it's my family, and I have to go let them in, open things up. So I guess we have to end the class here, right? Maybe it's Krishna's arrangement. I think maybe tomorrow we can continue. You could think of some more questions and we'll review. Is that okay? Okay. By divine arrangement, we will end the class now. Hare Krishna. Thank you for listening. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Go Premanandi. Hari Hari Bol.